Hey class. In this video, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to wrap up our programming project and we will go over the schedule for the end of the semester. This is actually going to be our last demo or video with new material. We just have a couple weeks left after this one and we're just going to be working on the final project. So this is the last video of new material. There'll be a couple more videos where I talk about doing the project brief for the final project and then submitting the final project itself. But we'll cover those after spring break. So let's just do a quick rundown. So we're gonna go over the schedule, final project. Then with our programming project, we're gonna wrap up that project. We're going to go over a couple things. So we're going to go over validating our input using conditional statements. So we'll validate user input. Then we're going to actually produce the story. So we're going to print the Mad Libs story for user. And then we're going to add some CSS just to make things look a little bit nicer. And then we'll submit the programming project. So that's everything we are going to cover in this video. So let's look at the schedule for a second, and I'll talk again about the final project. So if we look at the final project page, there's a description here. I talked about this a little bit last week, and I'm going to talk about it in more detail next time. So I'm not going to go into the detail again here. But just to kind of go over, this is everything that you're going to be responsible for. So with our programming project, it's actually not due for a little while. It's due on May 6th. We have a kind of a big gap for spring break because of the way that the schedule kind of falls with Mondays. So you have a lot of time to work on the programming project, but if you want to get started with the final project, you can do that. So here's the deliverables for this. We're going to start with the first week. We're going to do a creative brief, and that kind of looks like this. This is something you use just to kind of like pitch a project. And so if you work for, an agency or something like that, before you get started on a project, you're going to come up with a brief that explains what the project is and how it's going to work. And usually that'll get approved before you start actually working on it. So we're going to do an example one of those, and then make a project based on that. So that's the basic idea. If you want to get started early, you can do that during spring break if you feel like it, but you don't have to, of course. Today we are going to wrap up our programming project. We just have a few things to do there, and then I'll go over submitting it. Let's go over to Blackboard and just look at the rest of the schedule for the semester. So, excuse me. So we only have two more assignments. We have our programming project, and then we have our final project. And so these are the two things that we have left to work on this semester. If we look at the grades section, this will show us the due dates. So again, the programming project is due May 6th. This is the Monday after spring break. So this is a few weeks from today. So we have a little bit of time on this one. And then the final project is due May 20th. That's the last day for our semester. That's the last day that you can turn in any assignments. So any assignments that you haven't turned in yet need to be turned in by May 20th. So everything will be due May 20th. With the final project, if you want to get feedback or you want to submit it early so you can know that you've got everything for that, you can do that. If you submit it on Blackboard early, I'll see it. If you want to email me and say, hey, I want to make sure I have my final project, all together, you can send me an email and I'll take a look at it before the due date. So if you want to just kind of double check that you have everything that you need, you can do that. After the due date, you can't resubmit anything. So once you submit after May 20th, that's going to be the final day for all submissions for any of the assignments. So yeah, that's our schedule. We only have a couple weeks after spring break. So on the 6th, I will post a video going over creating the project brief and then setting up some templates for the final project. Then we have like a week where we don't really have new material. So I'll just post a video about submitting the final project. but you guys will be working on the final project, and then the final project will be due. So hopefully that makes sense. If you guys have any questions about the schedule, please send me an email, or you can message me on Discord, and we can go over that, but hopefully that should be pretty straightforward. So I'm going to get out of here. And so let's go over and let's wrap up our Mad Libs project. So I'm going to go to Code Sandbox. And I'm going to look for my project. I have a lot of you all's projects in my dashboard now. So maybe if I go to my folder. Oh, here we go. It's the JS project. Okay. So I'll go to Mad Libs version 1. I'm going to open this up. And so let's just take a look at what we've created so far. So I'm going to go to index.html and I'm going to preview this. So let's go to editor and go to default layout. So that'll show us our preview window. And so we can just review what we've done so far. So let's open this in a separate window. Okay, there we go. And I'm gonna go ahead and open up my inspector / console, my developer tools. That'll just let me know if I've got any errors or anything like that. So in our first lesson, we can close this now. In our first lesson, we just created a couple of inputs. So we added an input for the user to put in their name, and we added an input for the user to put in the location. These are just a couple examples. You can change this to match whatever you want the story for your Mad Libs project to be. And then we have a button to submit. So for the first week, your assignment was to add the rest of the inputs. So there should be at least 5 different inputs that go into the story. And those can be whatever you want. Again, we looked at this a little bit last week, but if you're needing inspiration, I would just Google Mad Libs, and you can find there's lots of different examples of Mad Libs on the internet. You can choose one, and you can see that they give you a lot of different options for what you can input. And so this could be a good place to start if you're looking for examples of what a Mad Libs looks like. So I still only have 2 inputs. You should have 5 or more inputs, and those can just go after the first 2. So that's what you should have at this point if you've done the first week's example. Of course, if you have questions with that or need help with that, let me know. Then we have a button to submit our responses down here. And so far, all we really have is if I fill this in and submit, we're logging to the console what we're getting from the user. But of course, that's not in the main page. That's just in the console that only a developer is going to see. So what we have to do now is we have to take these responses, and then we have to respond to the user with our story constructed from their inputs. So again, remember, these are just examples. I'm just using name and location as examples. You can replace these with whatever you think will work for your story. So that's our HTML. It's pretty simple. We're not going to change this at all or too much, I don't think. We are going to add some more styles today. We'll do that in a little bit after we finish programming. But most of what we're going to do for the beginning is work on our app.js. So this is our script, and this handles all the logic and the functionality of our program. So far, just to quickly review, what we've done is we've gotten references to the HTML components that we want to get input from with our name input and our location input. If you want these to be next to each other, that might make sense organizationally. I think I had that one later just because I had added it later. Then we have a reference to our submit button. And on that submit button, we basically are adding an event listener here, which when we click the submit button, we're going to run our input handler function, and the input handler function is going to take the input, and we're going to output some example. So we're going to add in a couple things here. First, we're going to detect that the user actually put in some input, and we'll use a new coding structure to do that, which we'll cover in just a second. Then, if they didn't put in an input, we're going to give them some message that tells them to put in an input. So if no input, message, we'll do like kind of an error message to the user. If all inputs, so if we're getting all the inputs, then we will print the final story. And so we have a couple different things that we need our program to do. And there's a lot of different ways that you could approach this. I'm just going to go over kind of a very simple way to do it so that we could just get our program running. But there's lots of different ways that you could approach this problem. Okay, so we looked at what the how to get the input value. So we use the Code Sandbox seems to be giving me a lot of hints. These might be useful. It's like, it's got some, I don't know if this is new. I didn't notice this before. Oh, it's got a new AI assistant. So yeah, all of these programs are adding AI assistants. I'm not gonna chat with Boxy, but feel free to check that out. That may be useful as you're working on your program. I'm gonna see if I can turn that off real quick. Okay, so I was able to turn that off by going to editor, user preferences, and then if you go down to this chat, you can turn off the chat. There's some other settings, but I'm gonna just continue working. There are a lot of little like pop-ups and things that happen, and you just kind of have to ignore those. But some of them are useful. You could try out the AI stuff if you want. That might be helpful. Anyway, so we have this name input, we have this location input, and the way we get what the user put into them is by using this dot value. And so what we can do is we can check that it has a value. If it doesn't have a value, then it'll just be an empty string, which we can detect using an if statement. So what we can do is say if, and it's very simple. This is something that's pretty specific to JavaScript, but you'll see the code structure is in every language, but the specific way that we're checking is particular to JavaScript. But anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if name input dot value, and what I'll say is if what we want to check is that if they're missing the input. And so what I can check is I can say if named input.value equals, and if it's just an empty string, so it's just two quotation marks, but there's no data in the middle, that means that there's no value. So I'll put a note here. If input is empty string, the user hasn't added text. Okay, so if that happens, what we can do is we can change the name input, and there's different ways you could do this. You could change the style. You could, put some text in there. You could do an alert box. You could do lots of different things. But we basically just want to tell the user that they need to put in a name input. So we'll say, let's put we can use actually a good thing to use here is the placeholder. So if we say name input dot placeholder, this will put some text into that box, but it's not the main text. It's this placeholder to text that shows up to, prompt you. And so we can say name input dot placeholder says, please enter a name. And then we can change the color. So another thing you can do in JavaScript is you can actually change the styling. So I can say name input dot style. And so if I say dot style, that gives me access to all the CSS styles for that element. And I can say, let's change the border color. This looks a little bit different than CSS because remember in JavaScript, we can't use the dashes that we use in CSS. So in CSS, we're allowed to use dashes like here, but in JavaScript, that means minus. So that JavaScript won't let us use a dash here. So instead they use the capital C for the second word in the variable. So let's just change the border color to red. So that'll just give this kind of alerts sense. And then what we're gonna do here is we're just gonna return. And what this return does is it ends this function. So none of the code that happens after this will happen. And I'll demonstrate that by putting this location input.value after the return statement. So I'm just logging this. It's not affecting the program, but it's just a way of demonstrating how it works. So let's save this. Let's go back to our Mad Libs program. I'm gonna reload. And you're gonna see what happens if I hit submit without putting in any text. It's gonna prompt me that I need to put in some text. So when I click submit, notice that it says please enter a name, and we see the red border on the input. And notice that nothing else gets logged. There's a log on 22, which is this empty name input, but there's no log on 32, which is the location input. Okay, so now if I put in a name and I click submit, now we see the name, and we also see, even though I haven't put location, let's put a location here. Now you see both of those logs. So what this return statement does here is it ends the function. So we can basically say if they haven't put in a name, we can just stop the whole function. And so everything else that is going to happen in the function won't work. So we're going to do the same thing for all of our inputs to make sure that the user has put in each input, because we can't generate the story if the user hasn't put in all of the inputs. So we're just going to repeat the same process, but we're going to change the placeholder based on what we're asking for. So now I'll check if location input dot value equals empty string. And there's other things that you could check here. We're just using this for an example, but if you were checking for a password, you might say you have to have a certain number of characters. There's other things that you could check using other conditional statements. Okay, so if the location input dot value equals empty string, then we'll do the same thing. We'll say location input dot placeholder, and we'll say please enter a location. And you're just going to do this for all of your inputs, but update the text to reflect each input. And then we'll say location input dot style dot border color. And you don't have to use red here. You could also use the background. There's different ways you could do this. Let's see if we use background color. I actually don't know if that will work with our input, but let's give it a try. Okay. And let's put our logs down here. So we'll see that these don't work if we don't put something in. Okay, and then I'll return here. So it's the exact same setup, it's just for our second input. So I'm gonna save that and then refresh my Mad Libs. And so if I click submit, we're gonna get please enter a name. But we return after that so we don't see the error for the location. So if I put in my name and click submit again, now we see please enter a location. So it did make the background red, but it doesn't really look right with the that text. So I'm gonna switch that back to border color. I think that looks better. Okay, so let's try that again. So it says please enter a name, click submit, please enter a location. I'll put New York. And then now when I click submit, now we see our responses over here in the console. So we're able to validate input. We're doing something very simple here. We're just checking to see did they actually write something. But there's other things, again, that you could check for if you were looking for different types of input. But just to keep things simple, we're going to leave that for now. And so if there's no input, we're going to error message. That's happening up here. So I'll put that up here. And then if we get all our input, then we're going to print out the final story. So we need to construct the story first. And so basically we need to take each part of our input and connect it to the rest of the story. So we're going to put a bunch of strings together. Strings are just sequences of text that look like this with a quotation mark on either side. But we can add them together if we just go one at a time. So I'm gonna make a new variable in here called story, and I'm gonna start out the beginning of my story. So I'm gonna say once upon a time, there was a person named, and then here's where I'm gonna add in the name. And I'm gonna put a little space at the end because if I just put the name right there, it's not gonna work correctly. So I'm gonna put a plus here, and then I'm gonna say name input dot value, and then I'm gonna, for now, I'll just add a period to the end, and then we'll add to the story after that. So that's the first line of the story. So I'm taking this one string here, and then I'm adding the value that I get from the name input, and then I'm putting a period at the end. That's just for punctuation, just for grammar. Notice that I have a plus on either side of this, and then each one of these strings has quotation marks on both sides. So if you don't format this correctly, you're gonna run into errors, so just be careful there. I'll show a couple examples of those errors that you're gonna wanna look out for. Uh-oh, my AI assistant is back. I guess I didn't turn it off. Anyway, let's give this a try. So for now, I'm just going to, it's doing a weird formatting thing. Okay. For some reason, it's when I save, it's putting this on a new line. I guess because it's too long. I guess that doesn't really matter. It kind of looks weird though. Let me see if I can fix that issue. Just a second. Okay. I couldn't figure out how to change that setting. There are actually quite a lot of settings in Code Sandbox. You can see why I like the P5 editor better because it's just much simpler. But you know, it doesn't really work anymore, so we have to use Code Sandbox. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this on another line because we're going to add to it anyway. So I'm going to move this back for a second, but then what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to end this line here. We're going to do this anyway, and I'm going to go to the next line, and I'm going to say story, and then I'm going to say plus equals. This is a shorthand to basically say take this value and add to the end of it. So plus equals is like, instead of just adding, it's also assigning it back to the variable. So it's just an easy way to basically say take this chunk and then add this next chunk. So let's log the story and just make sure that it's working. And then I'll show you a couple errors that you might run into with this type of formatting. Okay, so I'm just gonna put in some nonsense here just so we can go through it quickly. And so here we see once upon a time, there was a person named ASDF. Okay, so we see that that basically works. We've got the first part of our story and we've added our name in here. And just to prove that this works, if I change the name, you see the name in the story changes. So that's basically the whole point, is that we can take user input and we can change the outcome of our program. And that's really useful, not just for telling, you know, funny stories with random inputs, but also for doing all sorts of stuff on the internet, like logging in a user, adding a post on a blog or a social network, or anything else that we want to do on the internet. Okay. So let's look at a couple of errors that you might run into. So you may forget to put a quotation mark somewhere. If you do like that, if you do something like that, your program's going to start, but we're going to get a syntax error. And so normally with Code Sandbox, it kind of gives you this big syntax error to let you know that you're missing something. And you can see basically, you know, what line it's on. So that's really useful. If you were not in Code Sandbox, you might just see the error over here in the console. That's what the console is for. But since we're in Code Sandbox, we're going to be able to see the error here. So it tells us what line to look on, and it's sort of saying what it thinks is wrong. Sometimes this makes sense, sometimes it might not, depending on the syntax. But it's saying unterminated string constant. That basically means you started a string, but you didn't end it. So let's go back and we'll put that string back in. And we'll save that. And if we reload, now our story's back. Another error that you might make, this actually isn't an error, but you might forget to put in spaces like this. And so now if you put in this without any spaces, what you'll see is that your story has things like this, where it's not really formatted correctly because there's no space in between the name input and the text in the previous string. So that's why we want to add in our spaces. You might forget to put in a plus right here. So if you have something like that, you're going to get a different error. So it says unexpected token. So that's basically saying when you added in this string here, it wasn't expecting that because there's nothing in between these two. It needs like a plus or some other operator to put these things together. So if you see errors like that, sometimes it's usually just a typo. It's just a syntax error. Just like double check and make sure that you didn't forget, a quotation mark or a semicolon. Sometimes you might put like a comma instead of a period in something like this. That actually doesn't throw an error, but it's probably gonna throw an error once we get there. So yeah, it's confused about what's happening here. So a lot of times these syntax errors are just typos. You just misspelled something or forgot something. If let's say I forgot to capitalize name input, this is gonna throw an error. So if I go through this, it's going to say name input is not defined, and you might be thinking, I have name input, it's right there, but there's a capitalization issue, so it's not spelled correctly. So just look out for little errors like that, and the console and the errors from Code Sandbox will help us notice those. Okay, so we're almost done. Now we just want to complete our story, and we want to print it out for the user to look at. So instead of logging all this stuff, we're not going to do that anymore. I'll just take these out. We're going to finish our story. So I'm going to say story plus equals. And for each component of the story, you can just add to the end. It's just going to be this one long string. But keep in mind, you want to have like a space after periods, things like that, just so the formatting looks normal. So after we say once upon a time, there's a person named name input dot value, we'll say name input dot value, and then we'll add lived in, and then we'll add location input dot value, and then let's add, or I'm gonna put this on a new line because I think I'm gonna run out of space. So I'll say story plus equals location input dot value, and then I'll put a period at the end here. And then here's where you would continue to add your inputs and create your story. I'm just gonna wrap it up because this is just the demo, so I'm just gonna end it. So I'm gonna say story plus equals name input dot value plus, and then a space, and lived happily ever after. So this is a very short story. Yours should be a little bit longer with a little bit more, stuff related to your inputs, but this is a basic idea. I forgot a semicolon here. So we have name input dot value and then lived in. Notice I have a space on either side of this because anytime we go to another value, we're going to need spaces, or we're going to need to make sure we have the right, formatting. And then name input dot value lived happily ever after. So notice that I use name input dot value several times. I can continue using those inputs as many times as I want to. Okay, so now we've got our story. Let's print it to our HTML. So there's a few ways we can do this. Actually, this is something that we're going to need to add in here. So we could take away our inputs and replace it with just a paragraph. We could just put our paragraph down here. We could go to a new page and put our paragraph. I'm just going to make it kind of simple. I'm going to put all of this stuff into a new div so I can get rid of that div. And then I'm going to make a paragraph to print out the story. So I am going to have to modify my HTML just a little bit. So I'm going to say div ID. I'm going to call this input. And everything in here is going to go into this div. So I have this one div where all of my inputs are, and then I'm going to have another paragraph after this that's going to be empty to start, but I'm going to call this story output, and it'll just be sitting there with nothing in it, but we'll put our story in there. So I'm going to save that. And so now in here, or sorry, in my app, what I need to do is get a reference to my, first get a reference to the input, and then story output. Let's call this user input, just so it's a little bit more specific. Okay, so now let's get our references. So I'm going to say variable user input equals document.getElement by ID, just using the same syntax here, user-input. And then I have my story output equals document.getElement by ID, story-output. And we're going to go over a couple different ways to output our story, but we're just going to start with something simple. So down here, first we're going to hide our user input. So I'll say user input. And here, to hide something, there's a few different ways to do it. But the easiest way is just to say .display, or sorry, .style. So we're going to get the style sheet, and then we're going to say display equals none. That just hides, that just sets the display of that element to none, so it won't be displayed. Then we're going to take our story output, and the easy way to do this is just say .text content. So this is the text content, or the inner part of our HTML. We're going to set that equal to our story, and that should do everything for us. So now if we type in our inputs and submit, there we go. Our input goes away and we have our story. Once upon a time, there was a person named Owen. Owen lived in New York. Owen lived happily ever after. Okay, so there's a couple other ways we can do that if we want to interact with our CSS. So let's add a little bit of CSS first, and then we'll come back and we'll kind of work between our CSS and our JavaScript. Okay, so let's add some really basic CSS just to make this look a little bit more interesting. I'm going to open up my preview window so that I can see the CSS changes as I make them. So we have this body background color. That doesn't seem to be working, so let's see if I've connected my CSS. I haven't. So let's go to index.html. We're going to add in our link. href is styles.css. Type is text/CSS, and rel is style sheet. Okay, so now we see that background color. So let's go back to our style sheet. Let's choose a new font. So I'll say font family, and we get some nice options that Code Sandbox is prompting us, so we can use one of these. For some reason, I don't know when, sometimes prompting seems to work and sometimes it doesn't, but let's choose one. Let's see, maybe we can do fantasy. That's kind of cool, but I'm not sure that's exactly what I want. Let's see if we can get a new prompt. Okay, what about Gil Sans? That's kind of nice, that looks good. Okay, let's go with that one. Notice that it added a bunch of fallback fonts. This is probably because Gil Sans is maybe not supported on every platform. So everything that comes after the comma, it'll go to that next font if it's not supported. Okay, so then the black text doesn't really stand out that well on the background. So let's change the text color. Let's change it to maybe pink. See if that works. Yeah, that stands out a lot better. That's nice. And then I think I want the font size to be a little bit bigger. So I'm going to try 20 pixels. Okay, that looks good. I think I could even go up to 22. I don't want it to be crazy, but I don't have a ton of content. So that looks pretty good. So then notice that my my inputs and my buttons still kind of look the same. So let's do some formatting there. Let's go back to index.html. So for each one of my inputs, I have this div, but I haven't actually given it like a style or anything like that. So let's give this a class so that we can make it easier to style. So I'm going to make this div a input. I already have user input here, but that's an ID. But that's confusing. So let's do class equals input. Yeah, we can just use input. That's fine. This probably isn't like the best class name, but the website is very simple, so I'm not too worried about it. So we have these two class inputs. Let's go back to style.css. So remember, for a class, we just use dot, and I can say input. And let's go ahead and put a little bit of a margin on these. So I'm going to put a little bit of margin on the top and bottom. So I'll say like maybe 1 EM, so 1 font size. And then I'm going to put 0 on the left and right. I don't really want to change that. So that looks a little bit better. And then we also want to add a little bit of a something to the container. So I'm going to do container, and I'll say the width. I'm going to make this width pretty small because there's not that much content on the website. I'll say 600 pixels, and then margin is 0 auto as usual. That's just going to center the content on the page. And you could probably make it even smaller than that, but I think that's pretty good. Okay, so then notice that our button and our inputs, they have these default styles, so they don't match what we put for our body. So I'm going to make a style for button and input like that. Yeah, so this is a little confusing. This is the input HTML tag versus this is the dot input class that I made, just to make sure we understand the difference there. But I'm going to grab the font size and just paste it in here because they have their own default font size that's not going to get overridden by the body. Okay, so now I have the button and the input just separated by a comma, so I can set one style to both. And so now I have everything I want. And let's try this again and see how it looks. Uh-oh, looks like I have an error. Okay, let's go over to our preview window and see if we see an error. Oh, no, it works over here. I don't know why it doesn't work here. That's kind of interesting. Let's see. No? Okay. I guess, yeah, sometimes these online editors just don't do everything that we expect them to do. Anyway, we've got some styles. So one last thing we're going to do, so this is a good way to talk about how to communicate between CSS and JavaScript. We've already done a little bit of that by setting the styles of our inputs. So if I try to submit, it kind of makes these red. So remember, we set that up previously. So it forces me to do my inputs. And then let's say I wanted to highlight the parts that were input by the user so they can see where their inputs happened. We need to do a little bit more formatting because right now this whole thing is just one long piece of text. So we can see that in the inspector here. So there's no way to add a style to just my name or just the location. But we can do that if we do what's called inner HTML. So let's go back to our script. And so you don't have to do this. This is just an option that people often ask about. So we can demonstrate this. So besides adding text content, there's another thing that we can do here where I'm just going to comment this out, and I'm going to put story output dot inner HTML equals story. And what that does is it lets me put HTML actually into the text that I'm going to put in the story. So for example, between each name input, I can put a little div. And so what I'm going to use here is a span. And I'm going to say class is, need another class name here. Actually, let's just do a span, and I'll just use a generic tag for this. So I'm going to say span and then plus. Remember, you have to put a plus between all of our strings. And then I'm going to close that. So I'm going to say close this span. And a span is just like a very basic tag that we can use. I guess I can put this as one string. So this is going to put some HTML around my name input, which will allow me to style it in the CSS. So let's see what that looks like over here. Uh-oh, I got an error. Oh, I forgot my plus. Even as I was saying, don't forget to put your plus. I forgot my plus. Okay, so now if I fill this in real quick, so notice this first input, if I take a look at that here, it's inside of a span. And a span is just kind of a generic HTML tag that I can use to do some styling. So for example, I can add a rule for this span and just say, I can say font style, and say bold. And that can't really see that. Let's see. I could do italic. I guess there's no bold. That's kind of interesting. But I could also just do a different color. I could say color is purple. So now it stands out a little bit. So notice that it doesn't affect the other ones because I didn't add them in yet. So let's go back and we'll do that. Again, this is not required, but a lot of people ask about this. So I figured I would just cover it. So we're just gonna add in a span around each input value. Notice that I'm not adding the rest of the text in here. Again, you could add it if you wanted to. You can really, there's a lot of different variations. So if you have ideas about how you want it to look and you're not sure how to do it, let me know and we can find a way to do it. So I'm just gonna wrap a span around each one of these. And then I'm gonna add a span style in my CSS. So I'm just gonna put span. If I had a more complicated website with more spans, I would want to like add a class for this or whatever, but I only have the one type of input output. So I'm just gonna change the color here to purple. Or kind of like plum. Plum's probably too close to pink, but let's see what it looks like. Okay, so we're gonna put in some nonsense. It looks kind of nice. It's a subtle difference. Okay, let's see how it looks if I put in real inputs. Okay, not bad. Okay, so that's basically what I want to cover with this. There's obviously tons and tons of other stuff that you could do with your HTML, with your CSS, with your JavaScript, with all the other things that we're learning. But this just kind of covers some of the basics just to get us started. So let's go ahead and post this on the Open Lab, and then we will wrap up our programming project. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is take a couple screenshots of the project. So I'm going to grab this browser tab and pull it out by itself. I'm going to close the inspector, and I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller. It's interesting that it's not... Oh, I didn't make... Okay, actually, the reason it's not collapsing like this is because I set the width. So let's change this width rule a little bit. Instead of just width, I'm going to change this to max width. And you'll see the difference there is that now it will match the width of the window, but it won't go beyond that. So max width is actually a really useful rule. Anyway, let's take a couple screenshots. So here's the opening of the Mad Libs. So I'm just going to hit Command-Shift-4 on the Mac, and then I'm going to hit the space bar and turn that into like a little camera, and I'll take a screenshot. Then I'm going to fill in my inputs, and I'm going to take a screenshot of that as well. So I'll show each stage of the process, and then I'll click Submit and take another screenshot. On Windows, you can use the snipping tool, or you can use the Xbox game bar. If you need help with that, let me know and we can go over it. But now we've got some screenshots. Let's put this back in here, and let's go to the Open Lab and post our project. So we're just going to post just the basic stuff that we usually post. The title of the project, the semester and year, the coding / programming language, and then a short 3 to 4 sentence description of the project. So let's add a new post, and we're going to choose a category. So the category is programming, and then we'll make the title and call this Mad Libs. And so I'm going to put my images first. I'm going to hide myself for a second. So the first thing I'm going to do is go in here, and I'm going to add an image gallery. So I'll click gallery, and then I'll upload those screenshots. So these are going to be on my desktop. I'll just grab all 3 of them, click open. And so now we can see those there. They're kind of small, but that's okay. We get the basic idea. So then let's put the title of the project. So the title is Mad Libs, and you can come up with a different name for your story if you want to. And then the semester year is spring 2024, and the languages used are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And now let's include a link both to Code Sandbox and to the project itself. So I'm going to say link to the project, and I'll just go over here, and we just want to grab this link here. So whatever the preview window is, just that homepage of the link. So I'm going to select this text and click the link button and paste in. And if I want to edit, I'm going to make it open in a new tab. Okay, so then let's paste a link to our code. And for this one, I'm going to go to the Code Sandbox. I'm going to go to Share. And remember to turn off editor layout so we don't get those big long links. Just click copy here. And remember to set the permission to public, because otherwise we will not be able to see it. So then let's go back here. Let's link to our project here. And then I'm going to set this to open in a new tab. And then a 3 to 4 sentence description. So again, I'm just demoing, so I'm not going to do a whole long description, but you can write here about the story idea. You can write about the experience. You can write about any challenges that you faced or ways that you fixed your issues. And so I'm just going to write, created a Mad Libs story that takes a user input and outputs a unique story. Okay, so I think that's everything we need to do. Let's preview this and make sure it looks good. Okay, looks good. So then let's publish. Make sure to click publish twice. And we're just going to submit the link to the post on Blackboard. So you don't have to submit anything else on Blackboard because you should have linked to your code and to your project. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go over to Blackboard. Let's go to student preview. Let's go to assignments. And this is the programming assignment. And we're just going to create submission and just paste this link in here. So you don't have to link to Code Sandbox as long as you've linked to that in the Open Lab. We just want to see the Open Lab link there. And then we just click submit and we're done. So that's everything for the programming project. As usual, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to go over anything that you're working on. Keep in mind that you can fork this project. So I'll put a link to the project in the video description. And if you open it and click fork, it'll make a copy and you can just, edit and fill in your own version of the story, your own styles and stuff like that. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to go over stuff. And this isn't due until May 6th, so you do have a lot of time to work on it, but most of the time will be during spring break. So I would recommend just doing it now before spring break starts, and you can submit it early if you want to, so you don't have to do it at the last minute, but whatever works for you. So yeah, that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you guys in the video after spring break. If not, well, I'll do a review video tomorrow, so I'll see you in that one actually. Okay. All right.